All right, folks, we are now in the home stretch with our missed discussion of the Spartans. Thank you for being patient with me and for being willing to listen to these presentations and watch these videos in lieu of having class today. I really do appreciate it. The last thing I want to talk about is hoplite warfare. So this is important to cover because it describes the nature of warfare during the apex of the Spartan power. And this is the kind of warfare that the Spartans were training for. So this information isn't in Pomeroy. It also isn't in the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians. This is sort of an independent unit here that I want to make sure that we talk about before we get to talking about the Persian Wars on Thursday and before we watch 300. So this is really kind of this critical bridging piece. So, what was a hoplite? Hoplite was a soldier. They were infantry. All right, so this was a member of the army, not in the navy. A hoplite was called a hoplite because of his shield. So the name of the shield he carried was a hoplon. So we call the soldier a hoplite after the shield that he carried. So what I am going to describe here, the shield, the body armor, the weapons, this is all called a panoply. The panoply is the connection, or not the connection, but the collection of all of these elements, your weapons and your quote-unquote uniform that you wear when you're on campaign, when you're fighting. So a hoplite has a panoply, or a kit even, of armor and weaponry that he uses. Okay, so what did a hoplite have? The first thing is the shield, the hoplon. For the Spartans, and Xenophon mentions this in the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, this was a bronze shield. So Xenophon mentions that it's bronze partially because it's durable, and it is very durable. Shields were made from lots of different materials. Some were wood covered with linen or leather. Some were wicker, but bronze was by far the most enduring, the most durable. But on the flip side, it would also be very heavy. So that's another thing to consider. And a hoplite would use his shield in his left arm, so you can see in this image how it's strapped in. He has a strap that he puts his arm through, and then one that he holds in his left hand to control the shield. In terms of body armor, the hoplite had a couple of different options. One was called a cuirass, which is basically two pieces of metal that you would use. You would wear it as kind of like a corset, or something to cover your torso. The linothorax literally means like a linen-covered torso. Your thorax is the middle part of your body, between your legs and your shoulders. So the linothorax was a bit of armor or stiffened linen that would cover your torso and your organs, the bits that needed to be protected. All hoplites also had a helmet, so you could see with our soldier here, his helmet is to his left. Not all of them had these crests. The crests were made of horsehair, and the crests were intended to show a particular rank in the army. So this guy probably had a pretty high rank. Okay, so in terms of armor, he had his either a cuirass or a linothorax, some sort of body armor to protect his torso, and definitely a helmet to protect his head. Finally, in terms of weapons, the hoplite carried a spear. In Greek, this was called a doru, and a sword, or xiphos. So spears were not necessarily used for throwing all the time. So yes, obviously you would hurl a spear like a javelin. We saw Brad Pitt throw his spear at the beginning of Troy. That was one of the features of Bronze Age warfare. But more often they were used to stab. So if you can imagine a spear as a potentially penetrating weapon, it's desirable because it preserves a lot of space between the person who's doing the stabbing and the person who is being stabbed. You don't have to be at super close quarters. Whereas if you're using your sword, your xiphos, you do have to be in much closer quarters. And the sword was actually the weapon of last resort. Right? So for the hoplites, using the spear was far preferable, and it was only when things were looking really dire that you would actually pull out your sword. And then the way that hoplites fought was in a unit called a phalanx. Right? So hoplites fought in a phalanx. Phalanx is a line of hoplites arranged at very, very close position next to each other. So the idea was that when all of the hoplites standing next to each other would put their sword or their shields up, right, the shields would be round enough to cover not only their own body, but the right side of the man next to him. Right, they would move in formation so that a line would be preserved, a line of defense with their shields would be preserved, and then they would use their spear, their doru, to stab either above the line or below the line of shields, and that way they could preserve some distance between themselves and their enemy, who would be rushing at their line. Or, if necessary, if the line broke for whatever reason, they could also throw their spear. Okay, so what was really important in a phalanx was coordination of movement. So let's take a look at, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I'm having real issues with this PowerPoint. Let's take a look at how these battle tactics would work out. So first of all, as you might imagine, discipline was extremely important. If you're going to fight in formation with your phalanx mates, you all have to know exactly what the tactics are going to be. You had to have practiced how you're going to move in formation, and you also have to trust the person who is next to you. So if you can think back to the Spartan education system and the way that they trained young boys to become warriors, you can see why they put so much emphasis on building community, right? And really forcing these boys to live together and get to know each other, and in some cases truly love each other and maybe even be in love with each other, so that they were interested in protecting each other, but also to work together as a unit, to get used to living with these people while they're on campaign, to get used to doing whatever it takes to succeed, to win, and to survive. So creating that sense of camaraderie and love among your phalanx mates was critical to your success, because if somebody broke from the line, you had to trust that the man standing next to you in line was going to look out for you and was going to hold his bit to do his part to ensure that the whole line was successful. Helmets could be a problem because I don't know how many of you played a sport where you had to wear a helmet, or if you've been in any other situation where you wear a helmet, but they not only restrict your hearing, right, because you've got this metal, this metal can essentially over your head to protect your ears, but they can also restrict your vision because you lose your peripheral vision when you're looking out at those helmets, right? So you can't necessarily hear you can't necessarily see what's to your left or to your right. You can't always hear very well, and if you get hit on the head, that reverberation, even though your head will be protected, your skull's going to be protected, your hearing's going to be affected because there's going to be a deep reverberation when metal hits metal. So again, that discipline was really critical. You had to be used to moving in line with your phalanx mates so that if any of those situations did happen, if you did get hit in the head, if you couldn't see very well, if you couldn't really hear, you could at least trust your own training and trust that the person next to you was still doing his job. So as much as I hate to sort of make us recall movies as examples, you can think back to some of those training montages from Hercules with Dwayne Johnson. Remember, he talks to the soldiers that he's trying to train from Thrace hold their line and to be good, to use their shields and to really be strong and maintain that line. That's kind of gesturing towards hoplite warfare. Obviously, those people were not fighting in the same style, but it does have that same meaning. Another thing to consider, not another thing to consider, sorry, but what the hoplite phalanx was trying to achieve was called a trope. Trope means to turn away, right? So the goal was to be so disciplined and so strong in the line that you eventually force your enemies to break and to run away. And that would open up the opportunity for one-on-one combat, for pursual, or however the commanders wanted to eventually take down the people who were running away. The way that they did this was called othismos. What the othismos was to allow the attackers, right, the people who are coming against the line, to get close enough and to press against your phalanx, and then to shove them off, right, to produce a unified shove, which would produce that distance between the phalanx line and the enemies that would allow the hoplites to then stab with their spears. So you bring them in, shove them back, stab, and then start moving forward systematically. And in doing that, you'll eventually force a trope to turn them around. This sort of fighting was only good on certain terrains, as you might imagine. So if you were in quarters that were too close, you might not have a wide enough line. If you were on uneven ground, that would cause some issues for maintaining a line. This didn't really work in water, obviously. You couldn't really take hoplites into naval battle. I mean, there were certainly Marines where triremes would bring soldiers to fight with them, but you could not do that. Would necessitate more one-on-one fighting. You couldn't do this style of warfare in every single terrain. So that's something to keep in mind, right? What were the ideal fighting situations? So one of the things that we'll be considering as we watch these different movies about the Spartans is how a phalanx might help identify those who are those who have courage and those who are cowards. And, Xenophon kind of hints at that as he's discussing the ways that Spartan boys are brought up, that essentially they're shamed. This is a culture that is very comfortable with shaming those who aren't meeting their standards, or in some cases, simply getting rid of those children they don't feel like are going to meet those standards. So this is a very, it's an open society in that the actions of its citizens are observable by all and correctable by all. So imagine living in a society where not only your barracks mates, not only your commanders, but even like the people you see on the street, your parents, your sister, anyone can say, you're being a coward, you're not strong enough, that's not how you behave. They welcome that. They welcome that sort of constant correction. So fighting as a unit, as you might imagine, makes it very easy to point out who is not pulling their weight. Okay, I look forward to meeting with you all again on Thursday and talking more about this. And please make sure you're ready with some questions.